Suddenly his companions missed Beleg, and he returned to them no more. Now when Beleg parted from the outlaws and returned into Doriath, Hurin led them away westward out of Sirion's vale, for they grew weary of their life without rest, ever watchful and in fear of pursuit, and they sought for a safer lair. And it chanced at a time of evening that they came upon 3 dwarves who fled before them. But one that lagged behind was seized and thrown down, and a man of the company took his bow and let fly an arrow at the others as they vanished in the dust. Now the dwarf that they had taken was named Meme, and he pleaded for his life before Hurin, and offered as ransom to lead them to his hidden halls, which none might find without his aid. Then Hurin pitied Meme, and spared him, and he said, "Where is your house?" Then Meme answered, "High above the lands lies the house of Meme upon the great hill. Amon Ruth is that hill called now, since the elves changed all the names." Then Hurin was silent, and he looked long upon the dwarf, and at last he said, "You shall bring us to that place." On the next day they set out thither, following Meme to Amon Ruth. Now that hill stood upon the edge of the moorlands that rose between the vales of Sirion and Narog, and high above the stony heath it reared its crown. But its steep grey head was bare, save for the red ceragon that mantled the stone. And as the men of Hurin's band drew near, the sun westering broke through the clouds and fell upon the crown, and the ceragon was all in flower. Then one among them said, "There is blood on the hilltop." But Meme led them by secret paths up the steep slopes of Amon Ruth. And at the mouth of his cave he bowed to Hurin, saying, "Enter into Bar-en-Danweth, the house of ransom. So it shall be called." And now there came another dwarf bearing light to greet him, and they spoke together, and passed swiftly down into the darkness of the cave. But Hurin followed after, and came at length to a chamber far within, lit by dim lamps hanging upon chains. There he found Meme, kneeling at a stone couch beside the wall, and he tore his beard and wailed, crying one name unceasingly. And on the couch there lay a third. But Hurin, entering, stood beside Meme, and offered him aid. Then Meme looked up at him and said, "You can give no aid, for this is Keen, my son, and he is dead, pierced by an arrow. He died at sunset. Ibun, my son, has told me." Then pity rose in Hurin's heart, and he said to Meme, "Alas, I would recall that shaft if I could. Now Bar-en-Danweth, this house shall be called in truth. And if ever I come to any wealth, I will pay you a ransom of gold for your son in token of sorrow, though it gladden your heart no more." Then Meme rose and looked long at Hurin. "I hear you," he said. "You speak like a dwarf lord of old, and at that I marvel. Now my heart is cooled, though it is not glad, and in this house you may dwell if you will, where I will pay my ransom." So began the abiding of Hurin in the hidden house of Meme upon Amon Ruth. And he walked on the greensward before the mouth of the cave, and looked out east and west and north. Northward he looked, and descried the forest of Brethil climbing green about Amon Ober in its midst. And thither his eyes were drawn ever and again. He knew not why. For his heart was set rather to the northwest, where league upon league away, on the skirts of the sky, it seemed to him that he could glimpse the mountains of shadow, the walls of his home. But at evening, Hurin looked west into the sunset, as the sun rode down red into the hazes above the distant coasts, and the vale of Narog lay deep in the shadows between. In the time that followed, Hurin spoke much with Meme, and sitting with him alone, he listened to his lore and the tale of his life. For Meme came of dwarves that were banished in ancient days from the great dwarf cities of the east, and long before the return of Morgoth, they wandered westward into Beleriand. But they became diminished in stature and in smithcraft, and they took to lives of stealth, walking with bowed shoulders and furtive steps. Before the dwarves of Nogrod and Belagost came west over the mountains, the elves of Beleriand knew not what these others were, and they hunted them and slew them. But afterwards they let them alone, and they were called Noigith Nibin, the petty dwarves in the Sindarin tongue. They loved none but themselves, and if they feared and hated the orcs, they hated the Eldar no less, and the exiles most of all. For the Noldor, they said, had stolen their lands and their homes. Long ere King Finrod Felagund came over the sea, the caves of Nargothrond were discovered by them, and by them its delving was begun. And beneath the crown of Amon-Ruth, the bald hill, the slow hands of the petty dwarves had bored and deepened the caves through the long years that they dwelt there, untroubled by the grey elves of the woods. But now at last they had dwindled and died out of Middle-earth, all save Mîn and his 2 sons. And Mîn was old even in the reckoning of dwarves, old and forgotten. And in his halls the smithies were idle, and the axes rusted, and their name was remembered only in ancient tales of Doriath and Nargothrond. But when the year drew on to midwinter, snow came down from the north heavier than they had known it in the river vales, and Amon-Ruth was covered deep. And they said that the winters worsened in Beleriand as the power of Angband grew. Then only the hardiest dared stir abroad, and some fell sick, and all were pinched with hunger. But in the dim dusk of a winter's day, there appeared suddenly among them a man, as it seemed, of great bulk and girth, cloaked and hooded in white, and he walked up to the fire without a word. And when men sprang up in fear, he laughed and threw back his hood, and beneath his wide cloak he bore a great pack, and in the light of the fire Hurin looked again on the face of Beleg Uthalion. Thus Beleg returned once more to Hurin, and their meeting was glad. And with him he brought out of Dimbar the dragon helm of Dorlomin, thinking that it might lift Hurin's thought again about his life in the wilderness as the leader of a petty company. But still Hurin would not return to Doriath, and Beleg, yielding to his love against his wisdom, remained with him and did not depart, and in that time he laboured much for the good of Hurin's company. Those that were hurt or sick he tended, and gave to them the lembas of Melian, and they were quickly healed, for though the grey elves were less in skill and knowledge than the exiles from Valinor, in the ways of the life of Middle-earth they had a wisdom beyond the reach of men. And because Beleg was strong and enduring, far-sighted in mind as in eye, he came to be held in honour among the outlaws. But the hatred of Mîn for the elf that had come into Barin Danweth grew ever greater, and he sat with Ibun his son in the deepest shadows of his house, speaking to none. But Hurin paid now little heed to the dwarf, and when winter passed and spring came, they had sterner work to do. Who knows now the counsels of Morgoth? Who can measure the reach of his thought, who had been Melkor, mighty among the Ainur of the great song, and sat now, a dark lord upon a dark throne in the north, weighing in his malice all the tidings that came to him, and perceiving more of the deeds and purposes of his enemies than even the wisest of them feared, save only Melian the queen. To her often the thought of Morgoth reached out, and there was foiled. And now again the might of Angband was moved, and as the long fingers of a groping hand, the forerunners of his armies probed the ways into Beleriand. Through Anach they came, and Dimbar was taken, and all the north marches of Doriath. Down the ancient road they came that led through the long defile of Sirion, past the isle where Minas Tirith of Finrod had stood, and so through the land between Malduin and Sirion, and on through the eaves of Brethil to the crossings of Tegir. Thence the road went on into the guarded plain, but the orcs did not go far upon it as yet, for there dwelt now in the wild a terror that was hidden, and upon the red hill were watchful eyes of which they had not been warned. For Hurin put on again the helm of Hador, and far and wide in Beleriand the whisper went on the wood and over stream and through the passes of the hills, saying that the helm and bow that had fallen in Dimbar had arisen again beyond hope. Then many who went leaderless, dispossessed but undaunted, took heart again, and came to seek the two captains. Dor Cuarthol, the land of bow and helm, was in that time named all the region between Teglin and the west march of Doriath. And Turin named himself anew Gorthal, the dread helm, and his heart was high again. In Menegroth and in the deep halls of Nargothrond, and even in the hidden realm of Gondolin, the fame of the deeds of the two captains was heard, and in Angband also they were known. Then Morgoth laughed, for now by the dragon helm was Hurin's son revealed to him again, and ere long Amon-Ruth was ringed with spies. In the waning of the year, Mim the dwarf and Ibun his son went out from Barin Danweth to gather roots in the wild for their winter store, and they were taken captive by orcs. Then for a second time, Mim promised to guide his enemies by the secret paths to his home on Amon-Ruth. But yet he sought to delay the fulfillment of his promise, and demanded that Gorthal should not be slain. Then the orc captain laughed, and he said to Mim, "Assuredly Turin, son of Hurin, shall not be slain." Thus was Barin Danweth betrayed, for the orcs came upon it by night at unawares, guided by Mim. There many of Turin's company were slain as they slept, but some, fleeing by an inner stair, came out upon the hilltop, and there they fought until they fell, and their blood flowed out upon the Seragon that mantled the stone. But a net was cast over Turin as he fought, and he was enmeshed in it, and overcome and led away. And at length, when all was silent again, Mim crept out of the shadows of his house, and as the sun rose over the mists of Sirion, he stood beside the dead men on the hilltop. But he perceived that not all those that lay there were dead, for by one his gaze was returned, and he looked in the eyes of Beleg the elf. Then with hatred long stored, Mim stepped up to Beleg, and drew forth the sword Anglachel that lay beneath the body of one that had fallen beside him. But Beleg, stumbling up, seized back the sword, and thrust it at the dwarf, and Mim in terror fled wailing from the hilltop. And Beleg cried after him, "The vengeance of the house of Hador will find you yet." Now Beleg was sorely wounded, but he was mighty among the elves of Middle-earth, and he was, moreover, a master of healing. Therefore he did not die, and slowly his strength returned, and he sought in vain among the dead for Turin to bury him. But he found him not. And then he knew that Hurin's son was yet alive, and taken to Angband. With little hope, Beleg departed from Amon-Ruth, and set out northward towards the crossings of Teglin, following in the track of the orcs. And he crossed over the Brithiach, and journeyed through Dimbar towards the pass of Anach. And now he was not far behind them, for he went without sleeping, whereas they had tarried on their road, hunting in the lands and fearing no pursuit as they came northward. And not even in the dreadful woods of Power Nufuin did he swerve from the trail, for the skill of Beleg was greater than any that have been in Middle-earth. But as he passed by night through that evil land, he came upon one lying asleep at the foot of a great dead tree. And Beleg, staying his steps beside the sleeper, saw that it was an elf. Then he spoke to him, and gave him lembas, and asked him what fate had brought him to that terrible place. And he named himself Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn. Grieving, Beleg looked upon him, for Gwyndor was now but a bent and fearful shadow of his former shape and mood, when in the Nearnaeth Arnoediad that lord of Nargothrond rode with rash courage to the very doors of Angband, and there was taken. For few of the Noldor whom Morgoth captured were put to death, because of their skill in forging and in mining for metals and gems. And Gwyndor was not slain, but put to labor in the mines of the north. By secret tunnels known only to themselves, the mining elves might sometimes escape. And thus it came to pass that Beleg found him, spent and bewildered, in the mazes of Power Nufuin. And Gwyndor told him that as he lay and lurked among the trees, he saw a great company of orcs passing northwards, and wolves went with them. And among them was a man whose hands were chained, and they drove him onward with whips. Very tall he was, said Gwyndor, as tall as are the men from the misty hills of Hithlum. Then Beleg told him of his own errand in Tower Nufuin, and Gwyndor sought to dissuade him from his quest, saying that he would but join Turin in the anguish that awaited him. But Beleg would not abandon Turin, and despairing himself, he aroused hope again in Gwyndor's heart. And together they went on, following the orcs until they came out of the forest on the high slopes that ran down to the barren dunes of Anfaldi. There, within sight of the peaks of Thangorodrim, the orcs made their encampment in a bare dell as the light of day was failing, and setting wolf sentinels all about, they fell to carousing. A great storm rode up out of the west, and lightning glittered on the shadowy mountains far away, as Beleg and Gwyndor crept towards the dell. When all in the camp were sleeping, Beleg took his bow, and in the darkness shot the wolf sentinels one by one and silently. Then in great peril they entered in, and they found Turin fettered hand and foot and tied to a withered tree. And all about him knives that had been cast at him were embedded in the trunk, and he was senseless in a sleep of great weariness. But Beleg and Gwyndor cut the bonds that held him, and lifting him, they carried him out of the dell. Yet they could bear him no further than to a thicket of thorn trees a little way above. There they laid him down, and now the storm drew very near. Beleg drew his sword, Anglacher, and with it he cut the fetters that bound Turin. But fate was that day more strong, for the blade slipped as he cut the shackles, and Turin's foot was pricked. Then he was aroused into a sudden wakefulness of rage and fear, and seeing one bending over him with naked blade, he leapt up with a great cry, believing that orcs were come again to torment him. And grappling with him in the darkness, he seized Anglacher and slew Beleg Cuthanian, thinking him a foe. But as he stood, finding himself free and ready to sell his life dearly against imagined foes, there came a great flash of lightning above them, and in its light he looked down on Beleg's face. Then Turin stood stone still and silent, staring on that dreadful death, knowing what he had done. And so terrible was his face, lit by the lightning that flickered all about them, that Gwyndor cowered down upon the ground and dared not raise his eyes. But now in the dell beneath the orcs were aroused, and all the camp was in tumult, for they feared the thunder that came out of the west, believing that it was sent against them by the great enemies beyond the sea. Then a wind arose, and great rains fell, and torrents swept down from the heights of Tower Nufuin. And though Gwyndor cried out to Turin, warning him of their utmost peril, he made no answer, but sat unmoving and unweeping in the tempest beside the body of Beleg Cuthanian. When morning came, the storm was passed away eastward over Loth Lan, and the sun of autumn rose hot and bright. But believing that Turin would have fled far away from that place, and all trace of his flight be washed away, the orcs departed in haste without longer search. And far off, Gwyndor saw them marching away over the steaming sands of Anfaldi. Thus it came to pass that they returned to Morgoth empty-handed, and left behind them the son of Hurin, who sat crazed and unwitting on the slopes of Tower Nufuin, bearing a burden heavier than their bonds. Then Gwyndor roused Turin to aid him in the burial of Beleg, and he rose as one that walked in sleep. And together they laid Beleg in a shallow grave, and placed beside him Belthronding his great bow, that was made of black yew wood. But the dread sword Anglacher Gwyndor took, saying that it were better that it should take vengeance on the servants of Morgoth than lie useless in the earth. And he took also the lembas of Melian to strengthen them in the wild. Thus ended Beleg Strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harboured in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him whom he most loved. And that grief was graven on the face of Turin, and never faded. But courage and strength were renewed in the elf of Nargothrond, and departing from Tower Nufuin, he led Turin far away. Never once, as they wandered together on long and grievous paths, did Turin speak, and he walked as one without wish or purpose, while the year waned and winter drew on over the northern lands. But Gwyndor was ever beside him to guard him and guide him, and thus they passed westward over Sirion, and came at length to Aethel Evelyn, the springs whence Narag rose beneath the mountains of shadow. There Gwyndor spoke to Turin, saying, "Awake, Turin, son of Hurin Thalion. On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She is fed from crystal fountains unfailing, and guarded from defilement by Ulmo, Lord of Waters, who wrought her beauty in ancient days." Then Turin knelt and drank from that water, and suddenly he cast himself down, and his tears were unloosed at last, and he was healed of his madness. There he made a song for Beleg, and he named it Leia Ku Beleg, the Song of the Great Bow, singing it aloud, heedless of peril. And Gwyndor gave the sword Anglachel into his hands, and Turin knew that it was heavy and strong and had great power, but its blade was black and dull, and its edges blunt. Then Gwyndor said, "This is a strange blade, and unlike any that I have seen in Middle-earth. It mourns for Beleg even as you do. But be comforted, for I return to Nargothrond at the house of Finarfi, and you shall come with me and be healed and renewed." "Who are you?" said Turin. "A wandering elf, a thrall escaped, whom Beleg met and comforted," said Gwyndor. "Yet once I was Gwyndor, son of Gwyn, the lord of Nargothrond, until I went to the Nearnaeth Arnoediad, and was enslaved in Angband." "Then have you seen Hurin, son of Galdor, the warrior of Dorlomin?" said Turin. "I have not seen him," said Gwyndor. "But rumor of him runs through Angband that he still defies Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin." "That I do believe," said Turin. And now they arose, and departing from Aethel Ivrin, they journeyed southward along the banks of Narog, until they were taken by scouts of the elves, and brought as prisoners to the hidden stronghold. Thus did Turin come to Nargothrond. At first his own people did not know Gwyndor, who went out young and strong, and returned now seeming as one of the aged among mortal men, because of his torments and his labors. But Fingwilas, daughter of Orodreth the king, knew him and welcomed him, for she had loved him before the Nearnaeth, and so greatly did Gwyndor love her beauty, that he named her Feilivrin, which is the gleam of the sun on the pools of Ivrin. For Gwyndor's sake, Turin was admitted with him into Nargothrond, and he dwelt there in honor. But when Gwyndor would tell his name, Turin checked him, saying, "I am Agarwain, the son of Umarth, which is the blood-stained son of ill-fate, a hunter in the woods." And the elves of Nargothrond questioned him no more. In the time that followed, Turin grew high in favor with Orodreth, and well-nigh all hearts were turned to him in Nargothrond, for he was young and only now reached his full manhood. And he was in truth the son of Morwen Elethwin to look upon, dark-haired and pale-skinned, with grey eyes, and his face more beautiful than any other among mortal men in the elder days. His speech and bearing were that of the ancient kingdom of Doriath, and even among the elves he might be taken for one from the great houses of the Noldor. Therefore, many call him Adanahel, the Elf-man. The sword Anglachel was forged anew for him by cunning smiths of Nargothrond, and though ever black, its edges shone with pale fire, and he named it Gurthaim, Iron of Death. So great was his prowess and skill in warfare on the confines of the guarded plain, that he himself became known as Mormegil, the Black Sword. And the elves said, "The Mormegil cannot be slain save by mischance, or an evil arrow from afar." Therefore they gave him dwarf mail to guard him, and in a grim mood he found also in the armories a dwarf mask all gilded, and he put it on before battle, and his enemies fled before his face. Then the heart of Findwylas was turned from Gwyndor, and against her will her love was given to Turin. But Turin did not perceive what had befallen, and being torn in heart, Findwylas became sorrowful, and she grew wan and silent. But Gwyndor sat in dark thought, and on a time he spoke to Findwylas, saying, Daughter of the house of Finarfin, let no grief lie between us. For though Morgoth has laid my life in ruin, you still I love. Go whither love leads you, yet beware. It is not fitting that the elder children of Iluvatar should wed with the younger, nor is it wise, for they are brief and soon pass, to leave us in widowhood while the world lasts. Neither will fate suffer it, unless it be once or twice only, for some high cause of doom that we do not perceive, that this man is not barren. A doom indeed lies on him, as seeing eyes may well read in him, but a dark doom. Enter not into it. And if you will, your love shall betray you to bitterness and death, for hearken to me. Though he be indeed Agarwain, son of Ulmar, his right name is Turin, son of Hurin, whom Morgoth holds in anger, and whose kin he has cursed. Doubt not the power of Morgoth Baudir. Is it not written in me? Then Findwylas sat long in thought, but at the last she said only, Turin, son of Hurin, loves me not, nor will. Now when Turin learnt from Findwylas of what had passed, he was wrathful, and he said to Gwyndor, In you to bitterness and death, for hearken to me. Though he be indeed Agarwain, son of Ulmar, his right name is Turin, son of Hurin, whom Morgoth holds in anger, and whose kin he has cursed. Doubt not the power of Morgoth Baudir. Is it not written in me? Then Findwylas sat long in thought, but at the last she said only, Turin, son of Hurin, loves me not, nor will. Now when Turin learnt from Findwylas of what had passed, he was wrathful, and he said to Gwyndor, In love I hold you for rescue and safekeeping, but now you have done ill to me, friend, to betray my right name and call my doom upon me, from which I would lie hid. But Gwyndor answered, The doom lies in yourself, not in your name. When it became known to Orodreth that the Mormagil was in truth the son of Hurin Thalion, he gave him great honor, and Turin became mighty among the people of Nargothrond. But he had no liking for their manner of warfare, of ambush and stealth and secret arrow, and he yearned for brave strokes and battle in the open, and his counsels weighed with the king ever the longer the more. In those days the elves of Nargothrond forsook their secrecy, and went openly to battle, and great store of weapons were made. And by the counsel of Turin, the Noldor built a mighty bridge over the Narog, from the doors of Felagund, for the swifter passage of their arms. Then the servants of Angband were driven out of all the land between Narog and Sirion eastward, and westward to the Nemi, and the desolate Falas. And though Gwyndor spoke ever against Turin in the council of the king, holding it an ill policy, he fell into dishonor, and none heeded him, for his strength was small, and he was no longer forward in arms. Thus Nargothrond was revealed to the wrath and hatred of Morgoth. But still at Durin's prayer his true name was not spoken, and though the fame of his deeds came into Doriath and to the ears of Thingol, rumor spoke only of the black sword of Nargothrond. In that time of respite and hope, when, because of the deeds of the Mormagil, the power of Morgoth was stemmed west of Sirion, Morwen fled at last from Dor Lomin with Nienor her daughter, and adventured the long journey to Thingol's halls. There new grief awaited her, for she found Turin gone, and to Doriath there had come no tidings since the dragon helm had vanished from the lands west of Sirion. But Morwen remained in Doriath with Nienor as guests of Thingol and Melian, and were treated with honor. Now it came to pass, when 495 years had passed since the rising of the moon, in the spring of the year, there came to Nargothrond 2 elves named Gelmir and Arminas. They were of Angrot's people, but since the Dagor Bragolach, they dwelt in the south with Círdan the shipwright. From their far journeys they brought tidings of a great mustering of orcs and evil creatures under the eaves of Ered Wethrin and in the pass of Sirion. And they told also that Ulmo had come to Círdan, giving warning that great peril drew nigh to Nargothrond. Hear the words of the Lord of Waters, said they to the king. Thus he spoke to Círdan the shipwright. The evil of the north has defiled the springs of Sirion, and my power withdraws from the fingers of the flowing waters. But a worse thing is yet to come forth. Say therefore to the Lord of Nargothrond, shut the doors of the fortress and go not abroad. Cast the stones of your pride into the loud river, that the creeping evil may not find the gate. Orodreth was troubled by the dark words of the messengers, but Hurin would by no means hearken to these counsels, and least of all would he suffer the great bridge to be cast down, for he was become proud and stern, and would order all things as he wished. Soon afterwards, Handir, lord of Brethil, was slain, for the orcs invaded his land, and Handir gave them battle. But the men of Breth, in the autumn of the year, biding his hour, Morgoth loosed upon the people of Narog the great host that he had long prepared. And Glaurung the Uruloki passed over Anfaudith, and came thence into the north vales of Sirion, and there did great evil. Under the shadows of Ered Wethrin, he defiled the Aethel Ivrin, and thence he passed into the realm of Nargothrond, and burnt the Talath Dirnan, the guarded plain between Narog and Tegin. Then the warriors of Nargothrond went forth, and tall and terrible on that day looked Hurin, and the heart of the host was upheld, as he rode on the right hand of Orodreth. But greater far was the host of Morgoth than any scouts had told, and none but Hurin, defended by his dwarf mast, could withstand the approach of Glaurung. And the elves were driven back and pressed by the orcs into the field of Tumhalat, between Ginglith and Narog, and there they were penned. On that day, all the pride and host of Nargothrond withered away. And Orodreth was slain in the forefront of the battle, and Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, was wounded to the death. But Hurin came to his aid, and all fled before him.